It's 1,000 times longer than any monument ever built. Started before the birth of Christ, it was still being built when Columbus sailed to America, and millions died in its making. What unspeakable fears drove the Chinese to build the Great Wall, a wall they called the longest cemetery in the world. This is the wall that everybody knows about, where American presidents pose and millions of tourists visit every year. But few of those visitors realize that the floor they are rapidly wearing away and the walls they carved their initials on is younger than they are, rebuilt only a few decades ago. But there is a lost wall, rarely visited and seldom filmed, that lies just over the horizon. This is the real Great Wall of China. It starts on the shores of the Yellow Sea and stretches through the mountains north of Beijing and into the heartland of North China. It has great fortified castles and watchtowers at crucial mountain passes where enemy armies could easily breach the defenses. It runs down to the shoreline of great rivers. Then, for thousands of miles, it stretches through uninhabited deserts, across unscalable mountains. At first, it is built of stone, but as it reaches the desert, it reverses into mud brick. And finally, the Great Wall ends here, at this lonely watchtower, overlooking the White River. It's the greatest feat of engineering in the world, running a staggering total of more than 4,000 miles from start to finish. This is the 15th dawn Cheng Dowling has photographed in this month alone. But Cheng is not only a photographer. He is a man who has dedicated his life to discovering everything he can about the Great Wall of China. For years, he searched the Chinese countryside for evidence of long-forgotten and abandoned walls. Often, the only clue he has is from some ancient text. And it is up to him to puzzle out the arcane references and make them fit the modern landscape. Armed only with a walking stick to fend off snakes and rabid dogs, he has walked many thousands of miles. But he has had many successes. After struggling up this forested mountainside, he discovered a long-lost wall. No one had ever noticed it before, but once it was part of an ancient Great Wall, though much earlier and in a completely different location from the wall everyone knows. And the more scientists and archaeologists probe, the more mysterious it all becomes. In a lifetime of searching, Cheng has discovered thousands of miles of forgotten walls. In fact, if you add up all the walls that we now know about, it comes to a staggering total of 35,000 miles, almost enough to stretch around the planet twice. But why build so many walls at such an enormous cost? What were the Chinese afraid of? It was said you could smell them coming, even before you heard the thunder of their hooves. Then they were on you, slaughtering, raping, pillaging, and burning. Behind them, they left a trail of smoking cities and bleached bones. They were the nomadic hordes of the northern plains, the Huns, Mongols, Manchus, all at war with the settled life of the Chinese. The Chinese were terrified by the nomads and detested their harsh way of life. A famous poem said, "They have no fields or pastures, only wastes where white bones lie among yellow sands." Nomads lived solely off their livestock. Their animals provided every basic need: food, milk, meat, hides for clothes, and the yurt, the nomadic tent. Animal dung provided fuel. In this uncompromising landscape, it was the only way to fuel a fire. The harsh climate kept the nomads always on the move, looking for pasture suitable for their flocks. When disease and freezing weather decimated their animals, the nomadic hordes raided the Chinese when they refused to trade with them. China had everything the nomads didn't have: rice, silk, writing, and a very elaborate civilization. The Great Wall was a barrier between the civilized world of the Chinese and barbarians. Throughout their long history, the Chinese have been farmers. If you are committed to your land, you stay put and accumulate possessions. Land, livestock, and homes that you fill with furniture and goods. It's a way of life constantly threatened by nomadic raids. And so from earliest times, the Chinese built walls. Walls around their homes, walls around their cities, and walls around their country to keep the have-nots out. Wall building was so deeply ingrained in the Chinese mentality that the Chinese character for city is also the Chinese character for wall. Building a wall surrounding a country the size of China needed a man of prodigious ego and power, a man so powerful that China is named after him, Emperor Qin, the first emperor of China. He began 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, with a wall stretching more than 4,000 miles from Lintao in modern central China, across deserts, over mountains and plateaux, all the way to the Korean border. Incredibly, it was built in only 12 years. Imagine building a wall 32 feet high, 15 feet wide from New York to California without any modern equipment. The Emperor Qin was a remarkable man. Originally, Qin ruled only a small state in the northwest corner of China, but that wasn't enough for him. Qin built an invincible army, and one by one he conquered his neighbors. It was said, Qin ate up his neighbors as a silkworm devours a leaf. With all of China under his rule, Emperor Qin standardized measurements, created a single currency, the world's first euro. That's the good news. The bad news is that he was a paranoid tyrant who rewrote history to begin with himself. Qin's tomb reveals both how magnificent and terrifying his reign must have been. Here in 1974, just to the east of his tomb, a vast buried army was discovered. A terracotta army guarding its emperor from evil spirits. These aren't miniatures. They are life-size. So far, the Chinese have only dug up 10% of the site, and already thousands of warriors and some 10,000 weapons have been discovered. Look closely at the faces. Each one is different. The terracotta army was sculpted from its real-life counterpart. The army is drawn up in battle formation. At the rear, a command post of senior generals give commands, their age and status shown by their spreading waistlines. In all, it took almost 700,000 men 38 years to complete the construction of Emperor Qin's tomb. Once China was united, and he had reorganized his empire, Qin sent 300,000 soldiers to the northern frontier to drive back the ever-threatening nomads. When their job was done, Qin ordered his army to stay, and with an extra 500,000 peasants, they built the first Great Wall of China. The wall was made with compressed earth. It's a technique still used every day in the Chinese countryside. First, wooden planks are laid parallel to one another, as wide apart as the wall's thickness. Then earth is shoveled between the planks, watered and packed down by human feet. Then the planks are built upwards, and the wall continues to grow layer by layer. It is a cheap and fast way to make a wall. 100 times easier, it has been calculated, than building with stone. That's how Qin built 4,000 miles of wall in just 12 years. Surprisingly, these walls can last a very long time. The walls of this ancient city are nearly 2,000 years old, preserved by the extreme dryness of the Gobi Desert's climate. The wall protected China, but it took a terrible toll on its people. Millions of men died of exhaustion while working on the wall. Some say the dead were used as mortar and buried in it. They said that the bones of the dead were so numerous, it turned the mortar of the wall white. No one escaped the terrible rule of the Emperor Qin. Every peasant paid his taxes and contributed to the growing wealth of his empire. The greatness of China was built on the backs of the poor, and the history of the Qin dynasty is laced with tales of sadness. There is a fairy tale in China as well known to the Chinese as the story of Snow White or Robin Hood is to us. In the heart of a harsh winter, Meng Chengnu decided to visit her husband, who had been sent to work on the construction of the wall. Bringing warm clothes for her beloved husband, she went to the first tower and asked the soldiers where she could find him. They knew he was dead, but they couldn't bring themselves to tell her the truth. So they sent her to the next watchtower along the wall. Once again, she was told the same story. So she walked along the wall, searching desperately for her husband, from the Tibetan Plateau to the Yellow Sea. Here at last, someone told her that her husband was dead, one of the million tortured souls who haunted the wall. Her sadness was so great, and her despair so intense, that her tears made a great breach in the wall. There is still a temple dedicated to Meng Chengnu. Here, pilgrims come to ring the bell for good luck and offer a prayer in front of her statue. They can even look through a telescope at the breach in the wall caused by the tears of their long-dead heroine. In the years years after Emperor Qin's death, the people revolted against his empire. They seized the weapons of his terracotta army and smashed its harmless soldiers, setting roof timbers on fire and burying the army until its recent discovery. But this peasant revolt had little effect on future emperors. Soon, a new dynasty began to build a wall even greater than Emperor Qin's. Emperor Qin built his great wall with the blood and lives of the peasants. Now a new dynasty, the Han, continued his obsession with wall building, but they had some extra help. The bronze statue of the Flying Horse of Hunan is one of the greatest discoveries in Chinese archaeology. This was the ultimate weapon of the Han Dynasty, a new breed of horse introduced into China by her nomadic enemies. It was stronger, faster, and tougher than any horse the Chinese had ever seen. It was the cruise missile of that generation, so it is no wonder the artist crafted it flying through the air, its hooves resting on the back of a startled swallow. Now, despite their military success, the new rulers of China, the Han, still needed a great wall. So around the time that Christ was alive, they constructed a second great wall. In total, this great wall stretched for 6,700 miles and was the longest construction in all human history. It is a staggering 2,700 miles longer than the first Great Wall of the Emperor Qin. There is no wood, water, or stone in the desert, but the Han managed to build a wall that has resisted 2,000 years of erosion. You can still see the layers constructed with only local materials, layers of compressed sand, twigs, bark, tamarisk, and horse manure. The wall has withstood conditions that alternate between torrid heat for half the year and freezing winds for the rest. Building this wall in the middle of the barren desert was only half the task. It had to be manned. Soldiers were constantly told to be vigilant and not to move an inch from their posts. This was particularly true of those manning these towers, built miles in front of the actual wall. Despite millions of soldiers in the army, the wall is so long they didn't have enough men to post a sentry every few yards, so plenty of advance warning from these towers was crucial. Using smoke signals, the Chinese evolved a highly sophisticated and successful signaling system. A beacon lit here in the Gobi can pass its message some 700 miles in only 24 hours, alerting the entire frontier to the danger.
Chariots and horsemen are directed to keep on guard, and the men at the watchtowers to keep a sharp lookout for fire signals and keep the border clear,
says a Han military document. Each beacon was constructed within clear view of its nearest neighbor, so that fire signals at night or smoke in the day could be seen and the message passed on. We know so much about these ancient lives because the dry Gobi Desert has preserved their letters, buried next to the watchtowers where they lived and often died.
Dear all, in this far-off labor camp, I must clear grounds in the middle of the sands.
This remote camp
no
is like a tomb, and I miss you so
Last
much.
week, I received a punishment.
I can't express properly my gratitude toward you, dear elder brother.
Do you remember that night?
Take care of our parents.
We drank so much.
Thanks for the food and medicine you sent me. Words can't translate what my heart feels for you. There is always some assignment.
Today, we made 150 bricks. We all look like slaves. The moon is shining through a sea of clouds. When we are on guard, all we can see is this desolate landscape, devoid of any sign of life. The memory of our home becomes so painful, our exile seems as though it will never end.
And many never returned home, ending up in graveyards like this one. Large tombs for generals, small ones for the soldiers. And all of them died defending the Great Wall. But the soldiers' misery did benefit someone. Their presence provided safety from attacks to traders and travelers. Hugging the wall for protection from bandits, caravans left China laden with silk, furs, pottery, and rhubarb, a plant unknown in the West and highly prized as a medicine. This was the famed Silk Road. The traders returned with gold, ivory, and coral. It was a dangerous route, running through some of the world's worst deserts. But at least the wall and its guards stopped raids by nomadic bandits along much of its length. The Great Wall was the start of a wonderful chain reaction for the Han Dynasty. The wall protected the caravans of the Silk Road. The caravans increased and prospered, and the Han grew wealthy and extended their territories to the north and west of the Great Wall itself. Tired at lapping at the base of a wall they couldn't breach, the nomads thundered west and conquered Central Asia and Eastern Europe, threatening the other great power of the ancient world, Rome. When Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, marched on Rome, he was so feared that Pope Leo went outside the gates to plead with Attila to spare the holy city. The meeting of pagan and pope never would have taken place without the Great Wall of China. Legend says that Attila, highly superstitious, retreated because the Pope's name meant the lion. But it was just a short reprieve for Rome. A later fatal invasion finally brought Rome to its knees, plunging Europe into 5 centuries of dark ages. While Europe suffered, China was entering its golden age, the Tang Dynasty, the richest and most powerful rulers in China's history. Scattered throughout the countryside are spirit guardians, protecting the tombs of China's most golden age. One of the few royal tombs excavated is that of Princess Yung Tai, the daughter of an emperor. It reflects the luxurious life these internationally minded aristocrats led, with their fashions imported down the Silk Road and their games of polo. The Tang armies controlled vast areas on both sides of the Great Wall, so it was no longer needed as a defense, and it fell into ruin. To maintain order in the steppes, the Tang preferred to make their mark with trade and diplomacy, rather than with walls, and the best diplomats at the time were Chinese princesses. Every so often, a princess was chosen to marry a nomadic ruler, and was sent off with her eunuchs, servants, and piles of luxurious gifts. Exile was a torture for these princesses. They were used to being treated as fragile, precious, porcelain beauties. Now they were forced to eat chunks of boiled meat and drink fermented mare's milk and sleep with barbarian husbands who never washed. One princess lamented,
"A yurt is my home, felt are my walls. Sour milk is my drink. Living here in a foreign country, I dream of turning into a yellow crane and flying back to my home."
Sacrificing a princess to exile and life with a barbarian seemed a small price to pay for peace. It was certainly a lot cheaper than building and guarding a great wall. But this policy had only short-term success. A new danger was developing in the northern wastelands. China was about to face the most legendary warrior the world has ever known. Beyond the Great Wall, barbarians thundered across Asia, destroying villages, pillaging and plundering everything in their way. And here, China's worst nightmare began with the birth of a baby, his right hand drenched in blood, an omen of things to come. As he matured, Temujin grew strong, mastered the art of tribal politics, and by cunning and treachery became leader of his tribe, and then of many tribes. By 1204, all the tribes answered to Temujin, and he became the first king of all the nomads. They acclaimed him Genghis Khan, the King of Kings. It was said that his fierce and ruthless warriors never knew what pain and mercy meant. They could ride for days without dismounting. When food ran low, they just sucked the blood of their horses. No prisoners were ever taken, and they often slaughtered whole cities. Populations were so frightened that they would surrender without fighting. Genghis soon turned his attention southward, to the fertile lands of China. The bloody hand at his birth was about to fulfill its terrible destiny. In summer, dried-up river valleys offered easy invasion routes for horsemen bent on sacking the rich Chinese towns of the plains. And this is why these passes were heavily fortified, even though they had let the rest of the Great Wall fall into ruins. A Mongol army of 100,000 warriors invaded China through this pass north of the capital, Beijing. It is still the main highway where the train and motorway to Beijing pass through the mountains. Genghis Khan halted here, in front of the north gate of the Jiyongguan fortress. The Chinese pierced the ground in front of the gate with spikes to slow down the Mongol hordes, and sealed the great gate of the fortress with iron to prevent it from being opened. After a month of stalemate and no sign of weakening in the fortress, Genghis Khan decided to outflank it. He sent a team of soldiers through the hills, where the Chinese at this stage had not maintained the wall, and came from behind the fort. By the time the Chinese army realized what was happening, it was too late. The Mongols were swarming through the plain, attacking Jiyongguan from the rear. They destroyed the north gate and opened the way to the main army. Foreigners and barbarians now ruled China. It was a bitter lesson that the Chinese would never forget. The successor to Genghis Khan was Kublai Khan, who ruled the largest empire the world has ever known, running from China to the very borders of Europe. And he had no need of a great wall. He controlled it all. Despite his power, Kublai Khan wasn't going to last. The Chinese still viewed their Mongol rulers as invading barbarians. Devastating floods in the Yellow River triggered a popular revolt against the hated foreign rulers, and the Mongols were overthrown. They were replaced by a Chinese dynasty, the Ming, who were determined that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. These are the descendants of the men who built the wall for the Ming and chased the Mongols out of China. They are proud of their ancestors, men and women who built and defended the last great wall of China. That's why these farmers in a remote village still perform martial arts every morning before heading off to work in the fields. With the Mongols expelled, the new rulers, the Ming emperors, were determined that an invasion would never happen again. And so, in 1368, when Europe was being decimated by the Black Plague, the Ming rulers created the world's largest and greatest civil engineering project. even greater than earlier walls, because this wall was mostly built of stone. The Ming Wall stretches from Shanhaiguan on the Yellow Sea to Jiahuguan in the Gobi Desert. It lies across China like a long, winding spine, 4,000 miles in length, with thousands of watchtowers poking out like vertebrae. Much of the Great Wall was made of stone, a building material 100 times more labor-intensive than mud brick. The wall builders were not in the least daunted by spiked mountain peaks, and even among these misty mountain tops, the wall had to be zealously guarded. Watchtowers were crucial to the protection of the wall. If reinforcements were needed, the guards signaled to the village a mere half-mile away. Here, the old garrison walls of a long abandoned barracks still stand. Some 500 troops would have been stationed here, and if this wasn't enough, there were even larger concentration of troops in forts, a few minutes signaling away. In this way, a small number of men on the wall could alert an army of over 1 million men in a matter of a few hours. To build a wall to this standard was not easy. Much of the labor was carried out by convicts, who, if they died, had to be replaced by another member of their family, and so on until the sentence was completed. Hardly a method that encouraged happy workers. Every 50 feet, the builders installed drains to carry off rainwater. These waterspouts were always built on the inside of the wall, the side away from the enemy, so he couldn't lasso a spout and climb up the wall. Here on a steep slope, defensive walls rise in steps up to the watchtower, so if the enemy did make it to the top of the wall, the crucial watchtowers could be fiercely defended. The watchtowers themselves stand out beyond the wall so that archers could rain arrows down on any soldiers below. The tower had a covered area for the troops to keep warm, sleep, and store weapons. In an open area at the top, protected by battlements, the troops kept watch and could repel invaders. It is an amazing defense system, particularly when you see the terrain it was built over. This section is almost vertical as it climbs a mountain slope. Here it's only a couple of feet wide and guards a drop of more than 1,000 feet. Determined that no barbarian would ever rule China again, the Ming fortified every inch of Chinese territory, lest small bands get through and open the gates to a larger army. The Ming emperors were willing to bear any burden, pay any price, to keep their dynasty in power. And this is where they ruled from, the great forbidden city in Beijing. With its gardens, halls, temples, and palaces, the city sprawls over 180 acres, surrounded by a moat and formidable walls. The Forbidden City, a place of seclusion, a place where the godlike Ming emperors could rule and dwell without being inconvenienced by the ordinary citizens of his realm. Within its vermilion walls existed a life unique in all of human history. At its center was the emperor, whose days were filled with the complicated rituals required of the ruler of China. If the rituals were carried out, the country would prosper and the Ming dynasty would flourish. Serving the emperor was an army of concubines, and guarding the concubines, an even larger army of eunuchs. One of the last of the Ming, Emperor Wanli, was a weak monarch who managed to hold on to his throne for 47 years. Wanli ruled deep within his palace and was never seen by his people or his ministers, and rarely even by his eunuchs. Cut off from almost everyone, he had little idea of what was happening in the country he ruled. The Ming emperors were buried in tombs north of their capital, Beijing. The tombs all followed the same basic design, a temple in front and a walled enclosure with the underground tomb behind. Because Wanli ruled for so long, he constructed a huge tomb, and in 1956, Chinese archaeologists decided to open it, the only Ming emperor's tomb ever excavated. As the workmen opened the heavy tomb doors, a giant corridor was revealed, far larger than any Egyptian pharaoh's tomb, and there lay the lacquered coffins of the emperor and two of his wives. The tomb was opened by the communist authorities as a lesson in class consciousness, to demonstrate how the capitalist rulers had lived a life of luxury whilst the toiling masses starved. They could not have chosen a better example, as the lavish grave goods amply demonstrated, amongst them this light-as-air woven gold cap. The combination of lavish living and incompetent governing couldn't last. 24 years after this tomb was completed, the dynasty was over. But it wasn't the wall that let the Ming down. It was a love affair. The Chinese believed that their Great Wall, constructed by millions of workers, would protect them forever. But in fact, it was destroyed by a pretty face. The story begins with the sack of Beijing in 1644 by a rebel army. In the chaos that followed, a nomadic tribe, the Manchu, saw a perfect opportunity to invade. Their immense army marched against China, but the Great Wall remained intact. Not an inch of wall was destroyed or even damaged during the invasion. This is the fort the Manchu really wanted to capture. It was commanded by the greatest and most faithful general of the entire empire, General Wu. Which makes it all the more strange that he is not here among the fort's collection of China's greatest soldiers. He is not included because of what he did when he was confronted by the Manchu army. The general had only one weakness, his love for a concubine, the Lady Chen, famous as the round-faced beauty. Lady Chen unfortunately also attracted the attention of the Chinese rebel leader, who had just sacked Beijing. Desperate to regain his lost love, General Wu called upon his hated enemy, the Manchus, to help him crush the rebellion, and of course, free his beloved Lady Chen. Here at Shanhaiguan, General Wu did the unthinkable. He opened the gates of the Great Wall and let the Manchu army in. The greatest civil engineering project in history failed, but not because of any structural weakness. It crumbled because of the smile of a pretty girl. The new Manchu dynasty tried something different with their neighbors: diplomacy. Here in their lovely summer palace, they greeted delegations from all over the Eastern world. Attendance was compulsory. Neighbors were expected to pay tribute to the emperor. This was Manchu diplomacy. But guests had to be comfortable. The emperor even sent officials to Tibet to draw and measure the Dalai Lama's residence, and then built a scale model to make his guest feel at home. the Dalai Lama never made the trip. But the other great spiritual leader of Tibet, the Panchen Lama, did pay a visit. So great was his prestige that according to Tibetan sources, he was asked by the emperor to sit on the dragon throne, a totally unique privilege. Chinese sources picture him in a rather more humble pose, offering the emperor a sacred scarf. And for him, the emperor had his palace in Tibet faithfully reconstructed. It was certainly cheaper to build these great temples with their sinuous golden dragons than to man and maintain the Great Wall. The emperor even went so far as to learn Tibetan, so as to talk to his visitor without translators, and he ordered all the main public inscriptions to be in all the languages of the Manchu Empire: Tibetan, Chinese, Mongolian, and Manchu. Many monks settled here and still continued to worship, long after the last emperor had left his throne. And as for the Great Wall, it was allowed to fall into ruin once again, a defense no longer needed. The only wall the Manchu dynasty cared about was the one that ran right around their palace, built to protect the wild game they loved to hunt. The Great Wall, for the first time in its history, was of no value to the Chinese people. And now the wall's last intriguing chapter was about to be written. The Great Wall, the longest and most astonishing of all the world's ancient wonders, lasted 2,000 years. But it was only in the last 200 years that the West got a good look at it. In 1793, the British dispatched a diplomatic expedition to China, led by Lord Macartney, in an effort to open it up to British trade. When Macartney stopped to admire the wall as he journeyed across China, his Chinese guides were puzzled. Why would anyone be interested in a pile of ancient stones? One member of the team drew a sketch of the wall, one that was reproduced thousands of times, and is still how most people view the Great Wall today. Every ambassador to China received by the emperor was obliged to kowtow, that is, to bow 3 times, each accompanied by 3 acts of prostration, the forehead touching the ground 9 times in all. When the British arrived at the emperor's summer residence, they were lavishly entertained and spent days touring its beautiful parks and temples. Macartney, a good Englishman and loyal to his king, refused to kowtow to the emperor and provoked a huge scandal at the Chinese court. In their final meeting, the British were asked to bow to a scroll from the emperor, and when they opened it, its message was pointed.
We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. O King of England, tremblingly obey and show no negligence.
This is a story of pride. 2 empires, each convinced they were the masters of the universe. One of the British delegates said,
In short, we entered Beijing like paupers. We remained in it like prisoners, and we quitted it like vagrants.
Humiliated, the British plotted their revenge, knowing full well from all the military intelligence they had gathered that when it came to war, the Chinese were centuries behind the Western world. The Great Wall was obsolete. All of this is a constant worry to the man who knows the wall better than anyone else. Now in his 60s, Cheng Dalin spends every day photographing and looking for lost sections of his beloved wall. He worries that no young Chinese scholar is ready to take his place. He worries that the wall will be spoiled by commercial exploitation. And he worries that the more remote parts of the wall will be destroyed simply because no one knows their importance. As Cheng walks across China, he is also walking back in time. As far back as the Emperor Qin and the millions of Chinese who died building the wall. He is afraid they will be forgotten. As Cheng puts it, they died building the greatest construction ever built by man. Side for evidence of long forgotten and abandoned walls. Often, the only clue he has is from some ancient text. And it is up to him to puzzle out the arcane references and make them fit the modern landscape. Armed only with a walking stick to fend off snakes and rabid dogs, he has walked many thousands of miles. But he has had many successes. After struggling up this forested mountainside, he discovered a long-lost wall. No one had ever noticed it before, but once it was part of an ancient Great Wall, though much earlier and in a completely different location from the wall everyone knows. And the more scientists and archaeologists probe, the more mysterious it all becomes. In a lifetime of searching, Cheng has discovered thousands of miles of forgotten walls. In fact, if you add up all the walls that we now know about, the harsh climate kept the nomads always on the move, looking for pasture suitable for their flocks. When disease and freezing weather decimated their animals, the nomadic hordes raided the Chinese when they refused to trade with them. China had everything the nomads didn't have: rice, silk, writing, and a very elaborate civilization. The Great Wall was a barrier between the civilized world of the Chinese and barbarians. Throughout their long history, the Chinese have been farmers. If you are committed to your land, you stay put and accumulate possessions. Land, livestock, and homes that you fill with furniture and goods. It's a way of life constantly threatened by nomadic raids. And so from earliest times, the Chinese built walls. Walls around their homes, walls around their cities, and walls around their country to keep the have-nots out. Wall building was so deeply ingrained in the Chinese mentality that the Chinese character for city is also the Chinese character for wall. Building a wall surrounding a country the size of China needed a man of prodigious ego and power, a man so powerful that China is named after him, Emperor. It's 1,000 times longer than any monument ever built. Started before the birth of Christ, it was still being built when Columbus sailed to America, and millions died in its making. What unspeakable fears drove the Chinese to build the Great Wall, a wall they called the longest cemetery in the world. This is the wall that everybody knows about, where American presidents pose and millions of tourists visit every year. But few of those visitors realize that the floor they are rapidly wearing away and the walls they carved their initials on is younger than they are, rebuilt only a few decades ago. But there is a lost wall, rarely visited and seldom filmed, that lies just over the horizon. This is the real Great Wall of China. It starts on the shores of the Yellow Sea and stretches through the mountains north of Beijing and into the heartland of North China. It has great fortified castles and watchtowers at crucial mountain passes where enemy armies could easily breach the defenses. It runs down to the shoreline of great rivers. Then, for thousands of miles, it stretches through uninhabited deserts, across unscalable mountains. At first, it is built of stone, but as it reaches the desert, it reverses into mud brick. And finally, the Great Wall ends here, at this lonely watchtower, overlooking the White River. It's the greatest feat of engineering in the world, running a staggering total of more than 4,000 miles from start to finish. This is the 15th dawn Cheng Daling has photographed in this month alone. But Cheng is not only a photographer. He is a man who has dedicated his life to discovering everything he can about the Great Wall of China. For years, he searched the Chinese countries. It comes to a staggering total of 35,000 miles, almost enough to stretch around the planet twice. But why build so many walls at such an enormous cost? What were the Chinese afraid of? It was said you could smell them coming, even before you heard the thunder of their hooves. Then they were on you, slaughtering, raping, pillaging, and burning. Behind them, they left a trail of smoking cities and bleached bones. They were the nomadic hordes of the northern plains, the Huns, Mongols, Manchus, all at war with the settled life of the Chinese. The Chinese were terrified by the nomads and detested their harsh way of life. A famous poem said, "They have no fields or pastures, only wastes where white bones lie among yellow sands." Nomads lived solely off their livestock. Their animals provided every basic need: food, milk, meat, hides for clothes, and the yurt, the nomadic tent. Animal dung provided fuel. In this uncompromising landscape, it was the only way to fuel a fire.